The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as King Charles III adjusted his ceremonial uniform one final time. Today marked the third anniversary of his coronation, and the weight of the crown seemed heavier than usual. The ornate gold and jewels that adorned his head reflected the early light, creating small rainbows that danced across the palace walls. Charles had always been a man of routine, finding comfort in the predictable rhythm of royal duties. But lately, something felt different. The burden of kingship had settled into his bones like arthritis, making every movement deliberate and careful. He stood before the massive mirror in his private chambers, studying the face that looked back at him. The years had carved deep lines around his eyes, and his hair had turned completely silver beneath the crown. Down the hall, Queen Camilla was preparing for the day's ceremonies. Her lady-in-waiting, Margaret, bustled around her, adjusting the folds of her emerald green dress and ensuring every pearl was perfectly placed. Camilla had been unusually quiet this morning, her usual cheerful chatter replaced by thoughtful silence. She stared out the window at the gathering crowds below, her fingers nervously playing with her wedding ring. "Your Majesty, shall we proceed to the breakfast room?" Margaret asked gently, noticing the Queen's distant expression. Camilla turned from a window, forcing a smile. "Yes, of course. I'm sure Charles is waiting." The royal couple met in the private dining room, a space far removed from the grandeur of the staterooms. Here, surrounded by family photographs and personal mementos, they could almost pretend they were just an ordinary married couple having breakfast. Charles looked up from his morning newspapers as Camilla entered, his face brightening at the sight of her. "Good morning, my dear," he said, rising to pull out her chair. "You look absolutely radiant." Camilla accepted the gesture with a nod, but Charles noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she reached for her teacup. They had been married for nearly 2 decades, and he could read her moods like a favorite book. Something was troubling her, but he knew better than to press. Camilla would share what was bothering her when she was ready. The breakfast conversation centered on the day's schedule. There would be a ceremony in the morning, followed by a public walkabout, and then an evening reception for foreign dignitaries. Charles went through each event methodically, discussing security arrangements and protocol with the efficiency that had served him well throughout his years as Prince of Wales. "The Spanish ambassador is particularly looking forward to meeting you," Charles mentioned between bites of his toast. "He was quite impressed with your work on literacy programs." Camilla nodded absently, her mind clearly elsewhere. She had barely touched her breakfast, instead moving food around her plate in abstract patterns. The silence between them stretched longer than usual, filled only by the ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. Outside, the palace was coming alive with activity. Staff members hurried through corridors carrying flowers, polishing silver, and making final preparations for the day's events. The royal guard had already taken their positions, their red uniforms and tall black hats creating a dramatic backdrop against the palace's stone facade. Charles finished his newspapers and folded them neatly beside his plate. He had always been meticulous about such things, a habit that had driven his sons to distraction during their childhood. Everything in his life had its proper place, its designated time, and purpose. It was this attention to detail that had helped him navigate the complexities of royal life for over 7 decades. "Camilla," he said gently, reaching across the small table to touch her hand. "You seem troubled this morning. Is everything all right?" She looked up at him then, and Charles was surprised to see tears gathering in her eyes. In all their years together, through scandals and celebrations, public criticism and private joy, he had rarely seen her cry. Camilla was strong, resilient, the steady presence that had helped him through his own darkest moments. "I'm fine, Charles," she whispered, but her voice betrayed her. "Just a bit overwhelmed, I suppose. These anniversary celebrations always make me reflective." Charles squeezed her hand gently. He understood that feeling all too well. Anniversary celebrations were a double-edged sword in the royal family. They marked achievements and milestones, but they also served as reminders of all the sacrifices made along the way. The private moments lost to public duty, the the simple pleasures foregone in service to the crown. "Would you like to talk about it?" he asked, his voice soft with concern. Camilla shook her head, composing herself with visible effort. "Not now. We have duties to attend to. Perhaps this evening, after the reception." Charles nodded, though worry continued to gnaw at him. They had both learned to compartmentalize their personal feelings, to push through whatever private struggles they faced in order to fulfill their public obligations. But something about Camilla's distress this morning felt different, more profound than the usual pre-event nerves. The morning progressed with military precision. Charles and Camilla made their way to the throne room, where they would receive various honors and awards recipients. The room was magnificent, with its soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers, but Charles found himself focusing on Camilla's face instead of the ceremony. She smiled appropriately, nodded at the right moments, and played her role flawlessly. But he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself just a little too rigid. The first part of the ceremony went smoothly. Charles presented awards to various citizens who had distinguished themselves in service to their communities. Teachers, healthcare workers, volunteers who had made a difference in countless lives. These moments were among his favorites as king, the opportunity to recognize the quiet heroes who made Britain great without fanfare or recognition. Camilla stood beside him, offering warm smiles and congratulations to each recipient. She had always excelled at these personal interactions, her genuine warmth putting people at ease. But Charles noticed that her usual animated conversation was subdued today, her responses more formal than usual. As the ceremony drew to its midpoint, something unexpected happened. One of the award recipients, an elderly woman who had spent 50 years teaching in underserved schools, began to cry as she approached the throne. Not tears of joy, but deep, wrenching sobs that echoed through the formal space. "Your Majesty," the woman managed between tears, "I don't deserve this honor. I made so many mistakes, failed so many children. How can you reward someone who has fallen short so often?" The room fell silent. Protocol didn't cover this situation. The royal guards shifted slightly, uncertain how to respond. Charles felt his own heart constrict at the woman's obvious pain, recognizing in her words his own deepest fears about his worthiness for the crown he wore. It was then that something in Camilla seemed to snap. The careful control she had maintained all morning crumbled like a dam giving way. Without warning, she stepped forward, her voice rising above the stunned silence. Fallen short, Camilla's voice carried clearly through the throne room, tinged with an emotion that made everyone freeze. "You think you've fallen short? At least you chose your path. At least you had the luxury of making mistakes in service of something you believed in." Charles felt his blood turn cold. Every eye in the room was fixed on his wife, whose composure was unraveling before the gathered crowd. The royal guards, trained for every conceivable security threat, stood paralyzed by this unprecedented breach of protocol. This wasn't danger they could protect against with weapons or training. "Camilla," Charles whispered urgently, but she seemed not to hear him. Her voice grew stronger, more pained. "Do you know what it's like to live every day knowing that millions of people see you as a mistake? To know that your very existence is a reminder of pain and scandal? To smile and wave and pretend that the weight of history isn't crushing you?" The elderly teacher stopped crying, staring at the Queen in shock. The assembled guests and officials exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure whether to intervene or simply witness this extraordinary moment. Charles rose from his throne, his mind racing as he tried to understand how the morning had taken such a dramatic turn. "For 50 years, you taught children," Camilla continued, her words tumbling out like water through a broken levee. "You shaped minds, inspired dreams, made the world better one student at a time. I have spent decades trying to prove I deserve to stand beside this man, trying to earn forgiveness for a love that hurt people I never meant to hurt." Charles reached for her arm, but she pulled away, lost in the grip of emotions that had clearly been building for far too long. The royal guards remained motionless, their training having never prepared them for a moment when the threat came from within the royal family itself. "You speak of falling short," Camilla's voice cracked, "but every morning I wake up knowing that I am living proof of the institution's greatest failure. I am the woman who couldn't wait her turn, who couldn't step aside for the fairy tale the world wanted. I am the villain in a story that millions of people carry in their hearts." The throne room had become absolutely silent except for Camilla's words and the sound of Charles's labored breathing. He stood frozen, watching his wife expose her deepest wounds before an audience that had no context for understanding the decades of pain behind her outburst. The elderly teacher, forgotten in the drama, quietly wiped her own tears and watched the queen with a mixture of compassion and recognition. Here was another woman who had spent years questioning her own worth, doubting whether her contributions mattered in the face of perceived failures. Charles finally found his voice. "My dear," he said softly, stepping closer to Camilla despite her earlier rejection of his touch. "This is not the time or place." But Camilla turned to face him, her eyes blazing with years of suppressed anguish. "When is the time, Charles? When do we get to be real? Where do I get to say that this golden cage is beautiful, but it's still a cage? When do I get to admit that sometimes I look at myself in the mirror and see nothing but the woman who destroyed a fairy tale?" The weight of her words hit Charles like a physical blow. In all their private conversations, through all the challenges they had faced together, she had never spoken so openly about the burden she carried. He had known she struggled with public perception, but he had underestimated the depth of her pain. The royal guards, led by Captain Morrison, began to move with subtle efficiency, not to restrain or remove the queen, but to position themselves strategically around the room. Their primary concern was preventing any recording devices from capturing this moment, any cameras from preserving what was clearly a private breakdown happening in a very public space. Charles looked around the room at the faces staring back at them. Guests, officials, palace staff, all frozen in this unprecedented moment. He could see phones being quietly lowered, the guards' subtle gestures ensuring that this scene would not become tomorrow's headlines if they could prevent it. But Camilla wasn't finished. The floodgates had opened, and decades of carefully controlled emotion were pouring out. Do you know what it's like to love someone so much that you're willing to become the villain in their story? To know that your happiness came at the cost of someone else's dreams? Charles felt his own composure beginning to crack. This was his fault. All of it. The choices they had made, the timing that had hurt so many people, the years of public scrutiny and private guilt. He had asked her to carry this burden with him, had made her a target for criticism that rightfully belonged to him. "Camilla, please," he said, his voice barely audible. "Not here. Not like this." But she seemed to be speaking to something beyond the room, beyond him, beyond the present moment entirely. "I have smiled at crowds who would rather see me dead. I have shaken hands with people who whisper about what a terrible person I am. I have played the role of queen while knowing that half the kingdom sees me as an imposter." The elderly teacher, still standing with her award in hand, suddenly spoke up. Her voice was quiet but clear in the stunned silence. "Your Majesty, if I may say so, I think you've been carrying a burden that was never yours to carry alone." Everyone turned to look at this brave woman who dared to speak in the middle of the royal crisis. She stepped forward slightly, her teacher's instincts overriding protocol and propriety. "I've taught thousands of children over the years," she continued, "and I've learned that sometimes the greatest courage is in admitting when we're human, when we've made mistakes, when we're struggling under weight that seems too heavy to bear." Charles felt something shift in the room. This woman, honored for her service to education, was offering them both something they had rarely received in their royal lives: simple human understanding. "Your Majesty," the teacher addressed Camilla directly, "I may not understand the complexities of your life, but I recognize the look of someone who has spent years believing they're not enough. I see it in children who've been told they're failures. I see it in parents who think their love isn't valuable because it came at a complicated time." Camilla's rigid posture began to soften slightly. For the first time since her outburst began, she seemed to be truly hearing someone else's voice. Charles seized the moment, moving closer to his wife. "My darling," he said, his own voice thick with emotion, "you are not a villain. You are not a mistake. You are the woman who saved my life, who gave me the strength to become the king I needed to be." The room remained suspended in this extraordinary moment, watching as the most powerful couple in the kingdom struggled with the same human frailties that touched every life in some way. The royal guards maintained their protective positions, but their faces showed the strain of witnessing something far beyond their training or experience. Camilla's breathing was becoming more labored, and Charles realized that her emotional outburst was taking a physical toll. The stress of years of public scrutiny, combined with the weight of royal responsibility, had finally found its outlet in this very public breakdown. Camilla began, then stopped, seeming to realize for the first time where she was and what she had said. The awareness of her surroundings crashed over her like cold water, and she swayed slightly on her feet. Charles caught her arm as she stumbled, his training as both husband and king finally overriding his own shock. "We need to conclude this ceremony," he announced to the room, his voice carrying the authority that came with decades of public speaking. "Thank you all for your patience and understanding." But as he spoke, Charles knew that this moment had changed everything. The careful facade they had maintained for years had cracked open, revealing the human cost of their choices and their position. There was no going back to the way things were before Camilla's words had echoed through the throne room. The elderly teacher stepped forward once more, still clutching her award. "Your Majesties," she said softly, "thank you for reminding me that we're all just people trying to do our best with the circumstances we've been given. This honor means more to me now than it did when I arrived." As the ceremony came to its unexpected end, Charles guided Camilla toward a side exit, the royal guards smoothly facilitating their departure. But the echo of her words hung in the air, a raw honesty that had cut through years of royal protocol and reached something fundamental about the human condition. The guests began to file out quietly, many wiping away their own tears. They had witnessed something unprecedented, a moment when the monarchy had become achingly, vulnerably human. Whatever happened next, this morning had revealed truths that could never be taken back or forgotten. The private apartment within Buckingham Palace had never felt smaller to Charles as he helped Camilla to the sitting room sofa. Her face had gone pale, and her hands trembled as she accepted the glass of water he pressed into her grasp. The ornate surroundings that usually provided comfort now seemed to mock them with their grandeur, silent witnesses to a breakdown that would have consequences neither of them could yet imagine. "What have I done?" Camilla whispered, the words barely audible. She stared at the oriental carpet beneath her feet, unable to meet Charles's eyes. "Charles, what have I done?" He knelt beside her, his formal uniform now feeling ridiculous in the intimacy of their crisis. "You spoke your truth," he said gently, though his own mind was reeling with the implications of what had just occurred. Perhaps it was overdue. The silence that followed was broken by a soft knock at the door. Charles's private secretary, Sir James Worthington, entered with the careful demeanor of a man walking through a minefield. His usual composed expression betrayed hints of the panic that was surely spreading through the palace staff. "Your Majesty," Sir James began cautiously, "we need to discuss the immediate situation. The guests from this morning's ceremony are still in the building, and there are questions about how to proceed with today's scheduled events." Charles rose slowly, the weight of kingship settling over him like a familiar but heavy cloak. "What is the consensus among the staff?" "Well, Sir James cleared his throat, "there are differing opinions. Some feel we should proceed as planned, maintain normalcy. Others suggest postponing the public walkabout given the Queen's state of distress." Camilla looked up sharply at the mention of canceling events. "No," she said firmly, surprising both men with the strength in her voice. "We cannot let one moment of weakness derail our duties. These people have arranged their lives around meeting us today." Charles studied his wife's face, seeing the familiar determination that had carried her through decades of public scrutiny. But he also saw the exhaustion beneath it, the toll that maintaining royal composure had taken over the years. "My dear," he said softly, Perhaps we should consider, I said no, Charles. Camilla's voice carried a sharpness that made Sir James step back slightly. I will not let my personal struggles interfere with the Crown's responsibilities. I have managed to fulfill my duties through far worse circumstances than this. The reference to worse circumstances hung heavy in the air. Charles knew she was thinking of the early years after Diana's death, when public hatred toward their relationship had been at its peak, when protesters had thrown objects at their car, and newspapers had published the most vicious editorials about her character. Somehow, she had survived all of that with her dignity intact. Sir James consulted his tablet nervously. Your Majesty, if I may suggest a compromise, we could modify today's events. Perhaps shorter appearances, fewer opportunities for extended interaction with the public. What about the press? Charles asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. We've managed to contain the immediate situation, Sir James replied carefully. The guests this morning have been reminded of the confidential nature of palace events. Security swept for recording devices, and we believe we've prevented any unauthorized documentation of the incident. Camilla laughed bitterly. Contain the situation, as if my humanity is a national security threat. Camilla, Charles said gently, but she was already standing, pacing the length of the small room with restless energy. Do you see what we've become, Charles? We're so far removed from normal human experience that when one of us has an emotional moment, it requires a national response team. We've turned ourselves into museum pieces, beautiful but untouchable, perfect but completely unreal. Charles watched his wife pace, seeing in her movements the caged energy of someone who had spent too many years conforming to expectations that allowed no room for authentic expression. He thought about his own journey to the throne, the decades of preparation and protocol that had shaped every aspect of his personality. Perhaps, he said slowly, that's exactly what needed to be said. Both Camilla and Sir James turned to stare at him in surprise. Charles, Sir James began nervously, surely you don't mean to suggest that this morning's incident was beneficial? I mean to suggest, Charles said, his voice gaining strength, that my wife spoke truths that have been poisoning our marriage and our service for far too long. Perhaps it's time we acknowledge that the people we serve are human beings who struggle with the same doubts and pain that we do. Camilla stopped pacing and looked at her husband with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. You're not angry with me? Angry. Charles moved to her, taking her hands in his. My darling, I'm heartbroken that you've carried this burden alone for so long. I'm angry at myself for not recognizing how deeply this was affecting you. The truth was, Charles had his own demons, his own moments of standing before mirrors and wondering if he was worthy of the crown he wore, his own nights lying awake questioning every decision, every public statement, every gesture that might be interpreted as weakness or inadequacy. The monarchy was a lonely institution, made lonelier by the expectation of perfection. Sir James cleared his throat delicately. If your Majesties are determined to proceed with today's events, we should discuss strategy. The public walkabout is scheduled to begin in 2 hours. Strategy, Camilla repeated with a hollow laugh. We need a strategy to be human in public. Actually, Charles said thoughtfully, perhaps we do. Perhaps that's exactly what we need. Over the next hour, an unusual war council convened in the sitting room. Charles and Camilla were joined by Sir James, Captain Morrison from the Royal Guard, and Sarah Fleming, the palace's communications director. What emerged from their discussion was unprecedented in royal history. We could frame this as an evolution, Sarah suggested tentatively. A more accessible, relatable monarchy. One that acknowledges the human cost of service while maintaining the dignity of the institution. Or, Captain Morrison added pragmatically, we could maintain that nothing unusual occurred and proceed with standard protocol. Charles listened to the debate with growing certainty about what needed to happen. No more covering up, he said finally, surprising everyone in the room. No more pretending that we're somehow above the struggles that touch every life. If we're truly going to serve our people, they deserve to know who we really are. Charles, Sir James said carefully, what exactly are you proposing? I'm proposing that we stop hiding behind protocol when protocol prevents us from connecting with the people we're supposed to serve. I'm proposing that we acknowledge what happened this morning and use it as an opportunity to demonstrate that the monarchy can evolve. Camilla stared at her husband in amazement. You want to go public with this? I want to go public with the truth, Charles corrected. That we're people first, royals second. That we struggle with the same doubts and fears as everyone else. That our service comes at a personal cost, but we choose to pay it because we believe in something larger than ourselves. Sarah Fleming was frantically taking notes. This would be completely unprecedented, Your Majesty. The risk of what? Charles asked. That people might discover we're human? That they might see us as relatable rather than remote? What exactly are we protecting by maintaining this facade of perfection? The room fell silent as everyone considered the implications of what the king was suggesting. It would mean abandoning decades of royal tradition, potentially exposing the monarchy to criticism and ridicule. But it might also create a new kind of connection with the public, one based on authenticity rather than aspiration. Camilla sat back down on the sofa, her earlier agitation replaced by thoughtful consideration. You know, she said slowly, in all my years of royal duty, the moments that felt most meaningful were the ones when I forgot about protocol and simply responded to someone as one person to another. Exactly, Charles said, feeling a surge of conviction. Remember the woman this morning? The teacher? She wasn't honored because she was perfect. She was honored because she dedicated her life to serving others despite her own doubts and struggles. Isn't that exactly what we've been trying to do? Captain Morrison shifted uncomfortably. Your Majesty, from a security standpoint, this level of openness presents challenges. If you're no longer maintaining the traditional distance between the crown and the public, then we'll adapt our security accordingly, Charles interrupted. But we won't let security concerns prevent us from being honest about who we are. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with each advisor presenting concerns and alternatives. But Charles found himself increasingly convinced that this crisis represented an opportunity rather than a disaster. The monarchy had survived scandals, wars, and social upheaval by adapting to changing times. Perhaps now it was time to adapt to a world that valued authenticity over mystique. Finally, Camilla spoke up. If we're going to do this, she said, then we need to do it properly. No half measures. No carefully scripted responses that sound authentic but aren't. If we're going to be human in public, then we need to be genuinely human. What does that look like practically? Sir James asked. It looks like acknowledging that this morning happened, Charles said. It looks like explaining why it happened. It looks like using our experience to connect with others who struggle with similar feelings of inadequacy or unworthiness. Sarah Fleming looked up from her notes. The public response could go either way. Some people might appreciate the honesty. Others might see it as weakness or instability. Then, we'll find out which kind of people we're serving, Camilla said with a smile that was the first genuine one Charles had seen from her all day. And, frankly, I'd rather serve people who can appreciate honesty than people who prefer beautiful lies. Charles felt a surge of pride in his wife. This was the woman he had fallen in love with decades ago, the one who faced challenges head-on rather than hiding behind pretense. He realized that in trying to protect her from criticism by encouraging her to conform to royal expectations, he had been slowly suffocating the very qualities that made her extraordinary. There's one more thing we need to consider, he said. If we're going to be honest about our struggles, we also need to be honest about our love, about the choices we made and why we made them, about the fact that sometimes people find love in complicated circumstances, but that doesn't make the love less real or valuable. The room fell silent again. This was dangerous territory, touching on subjects that had been carefully avoided for years. The story of Charles and Camilla's relationship was well known, but it had always been treated with diplomatic vagueness, acknowledged but never fully examined in public. Charles, Camilla said softly, are you sure about this? Once we open this door, we can't close it again. He looked at her, seeing past the crown jewels and formal attire to the woman who had stood by him through everything. "I'm tired of being ashamed of the best thing in my life," he said simply. "I'm tired of pretending that our love story is somehow less worthy than others because it was complicated." Sir James was practically vibrating with nervous energy. "Your Majesty, the implications of this approach extend far beyond today's events. This could fundamentally change the relationship between the monarchy and the public." "Perhaps it's time for that change," Charles replied. "Perhaps it's time for the monarchy to be something more than a beautiful anachronism. Perhaps it's time for us to model authentic leadership rather than perfect performance." Captain Morrison spoke up. "If you proceed with this approach, the security team will need time to adjust our protocols. Increased accessibility means increased vulnerability." "Understand," Charles said. "But I'd rather be vulnerable and effective than safe and irrelevant." The conversation was interrupted by another knock at the door. A staff member entered with a message that crowds were beginning to gather for the afternoon walkabout. The world outside the palace walls was continuing its normal rhythm, unaware that the very nature of their monarchy was being debated in this small sitting room. Camilla stood and smoothed her dress. "Well then," she said, "if we're going to revolutionize the monarchy, we might as well start this afternoon." Charles rose as well, feeling lighter than he had in years. "Are you ready for this?" "I'm terrified," she admitted, "but I'm also more ready than I've ever been. I'm tired of being afraid of my own humanity." As they prepared to leave the private apartment, Charles reflected on the morning's events. What had begun as a crisis was transforming into an opportunity for fundamental change. He thought about the elderly teacher who had inadvertently sparked this transformation with her own honest admission of doubt and failure. Perhaps that was what leadership really meant. Not the absence of struggle, but the willingness to be honest about struggle while continuing to serve. Not perfection, but authenticity. Not distance, but connection. "Charles," Camilla said as they reached the door, "whatever happens this afternoon, I want you to know that I've never regretted loving you. Even with all the complications, all the pain it caused others, all the criticism we've endured, I've never regretted it." He took her hand, feeling the familiar comfort of her touch. "Nor have I, my darling. Nor have I." As they walked toward their public engagement, Charles realized that they were about to embark on the most important royal walkabout in modern history. Not because of who they would meet or what they would say, but because of who they were choosing to be. Not perfect symbols, but imperfect people trying to serve something greater than themselves. The transformation of their marriage, their monarchy, and their relationship with the public was about to begin in earnest. And for the first time in years, Charles felt genuinely excited about the future. The royal car moved through the streets of London with its usual ceremonial pace. But inside, the atmosphere was unlike anything the driver had experienced in his 15 years of service. Instead of the quiet formality that typically accompanied royal transport, King Charles and Queen Camilla were engaged in intense, whispered conversation about what they were about to do. "We could still change our minds," Camilla said, though her voice lacked conviction. Through the tinted windows, she could see the crowds gathering along the designated walkabout route. Families with children, elderly people in wheelchairs, young couples holding phones ready to capture the moment. All of them expecting the usual royal performance of dignified distance. "We could," Charles agreed, "but then we'd be back where we started, hiding behind smiles that don't reach our eyes, shaking hands while maintaining emotional walls, pretending that we're somehow different from the people we're meant to serve." The car pulled to a stop outside the community center where their walkabout would begin. Charles could see the familiar setup: barriers to control the crowd, security personnel positioned at strategic points, local officials waiting to make introductions. Everything designed to create the illusion of accessibility while maintaining careful control. Captain Morrison approached the car as they prepared to exit. "Your Majesties," he said through the intercom, "final security briefing. We've identified 3 main areas of concern along the route, and we have contingency plans for crowd control if the situation becomes unpredictable." Charles looked at his wife, seeing his own nervous determination reflected in her eyes. "Captain Morrison, I need you to understand that unpredictability may be exactly what we're hoping for today. We're not going to follow the usual script. Through the security detail's earpieces, Charles could hear the controlled panic in their communications. This was every protection officer's nightmare. Royals who wanted to deviate from protocol without clear guidelines for the new approach. "Sir," Morrison replied carefully, "could you provide some guidance on what not following the usual script might entail?" "It means we're going to have real conversations with real people about real things," Camilla interjected. "It means we're not going to smile and nod our way through another perfectly choreographed event." The car door opened, and the familiar sounds of a royal engagement filled the air. Children calling out, adults applauding, the clicking of camera phones capturing every moment. But as Charles and Camilla emerged from the vehicle, something felt different. Perhaps it was their shared resolution to be authentic, or perhaps the morning's crisis had burned away some invisible barrier between them and the world. The first person they approached was Mrs. Sarah Jenkins, the local volunteer who had been selected to make the initial introduction. She was clearly nervous, having practiced her brief remarks for weeks. But as she began her rehearsed greeting, Charles gently interrupted her. "Mrs. Jenkins," he said warmly, "before you tell me about the community center's work, would you mind telling me something about yourself? What brought you to volunteer here?" The question was so far from the expected script that Mrs. Jenkins visibly stumbled. Your Majesty, I suppose I started volunteering after my husband passed away. I needed something to do with my grief, something that would honor his memory." Camilla stepped closer, abandoning the careful distance usually maintained during public appearances. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Grief is such a difficult journey, isn't it? You never quite know when it's going to hit you." "Oh my, Mrs." Jenkins said, surprise replacing her nervousness. "Yes, exactly. Just this morning I was making tea, and I automatically made 2 cups the way I had for 37 years. For a moment I forgot he was gone, and then remembering all over again was like losing him twice." Charles felt his throat tighten with emotion. I think anyone who has loved deeply understands that feeling. The way loss becomes a constant companion, changing shape, but never really leaving. The small crowd that had gathered to watch the royal introduction fell silent. This wasn't the usual exchange of pleasantries and formal acknowledgments. This was 3 people sharing something real about the human experience of loss and healing. Mrs. Jenkins looked back and forth between the king and queen as if seeing them for the first time. "Your Majesty, may I ask, do you ever feel like the public expects you to have all the answers? To never struggle with the same things the rest of us do?" Camilla laughed, a sound that was both rueful and relieved. "Mrs. Jenkins, if only you knew. This morning I had what you might call a complete breakdown because I've been carrying exactly those expectations for so long. I've been so afraid of not being worthy of this role that I forgot I'm allowed to be human while doing it." The confession sent a ripple through the gathering crowd. People pressed closer, not with the usual curiosity about royal protocol, but with the recognition of shared humanity. Charles could see faces in the crowd changing as they processed what they were witnessing. "You know," Mrs. Jenkins said thoughtfully, "when I first started volunteering here, I was terrified that I wasn't qualified to help people. I kept thinking, what do I know about solving problems? I can't even figure out my own life. But the director here told me something I'll never forget." "What was that?" Charles asked, genuinely curious. "She said that the people who come here aren't looking for someone who has all the answers. They're looking for someone who understands that life is hard and that we're all just trying to figure it out together." Charles felt something click into place, an understanding that had been developing all day, but finally crystallized in this moment. "Mrs. Jenkins, I think you may have just described the kind of king I want to be. Not someone who pretends to have all the answers, but someone who's willing to acknowledge that we're all struggling together and trying to do our best." As they moved along the walkabout route, word of their different approach began to spread through the crowd. Instead of the usual brief encounters and formal exchanges, Charles and Camilla were having genuine conversations that lasted several minutes each. They talked to a teenage mother about the challenges of raising a child while finishing school. They listened to an elderly man describe his loneliness since his wife entered a nursing home. They spoke with a small business owner who was struggling to keep his shop afloat. Each conversation revealed something profound. People weren't looking for perfection from their monarchs. They were looking for recognition, understanding, and the sense that their struggles mattered to someone in a position of influence and authority. About halfway through the walkabout, they encountered a group of protesters. This was always a moment of high tension during royal appearances, requiring careful management to prevent escalation. But instead of being quickly moved past the group, Charles approached them directly. "I'd like to hear your concerns," he said simply, causing visible panic among his security detail. The protesters, a mix of young activists holding signs about Republican government and economic inequality, seemed as surprised as the security team. Their leader, a woman in her 20s named Emma, stepped forward hesitantly. "Your Majesty," she began, then stopped and started over. "We believe that in a modern democracy, hereditary privilege has no place. That the resources spent on monarchy could be better used addressing real problems like housing and healthcare." Charles nodded seriously. "Those are valid concerns, Emma. May I ask you something? If you could design a system of leadership that you felt was truly responsive to people's needs, what would it look like?" The question clearly caught the protesters off guard. They had prepared for dismissal or deflection, not genuine engagement with their political philosophy. "Well," Emma said, warming to the topic, "it would be leaders chosen by merit, accountable to the people, focused on practical solutions rather than ceremony and tradition." "And what would you say," Camilla interjected, "to the argument that some of our most effective leaders have been people who didn't seek power for its own sake, but who were trained from birth to see leadership as service rather than opportunity?" "I'd say," Emma replied, "that training someone from birth to lead also trains them to be disconnected from the reality most people live in." Charles considered this seriously. "You're absolutely right. That's exactly what traditional royal training has done. It's created leaders who are technically competent, but emotionally and experientially isolated from the lives of the people they serve. Which is why," he continued, "we're trying to change that. Starting today, we're trying to figure out how to maintain the stability and continuity that monarchy can provide while also staying connected to the real experiences of real people." Emma stared at him. "Are you saying you agree with our criticism?" "I'm saying that much of your criticism is accurate," Charles replied. "The question is whether we can evolve this institution to address those valid concerns while preserving what's valuable about it." What followed was a 20-minute conversation that was completely unprecedented in royal history. The King and Queen of England stood on a public street, without barriers, engaging in serious political dialogue with people who fundamentally disagreed with the existence of their positions. They discussed inequality, democratic representation, the role of tradition in modern society, and the possibility of institutional change. The crowd that gathered to watch this extraordinary exchange was unlike any that had ever surrounded a royal event. Instead of the usual mix of monarchist enthusiasm and polite curiosity, this was a group of citizens witnessing their leaders engage in the kind of honest dialogue that democracy requires, but rarely provides. "You know," Emma said eventually, "I came here today planning to hold up my sign and make my statement. I never expected to have an actual conversation about these issues." "And what do you think about that?" Camilla asked. "Honestly, it makes me hopeful in a way I wasn't expecting. Not necessarily about monarchy, but about the possibility of leadership that actually listens and responds to criticism instead of just dismissing it." As the conversation with the protesters concluded, Charles realized that something fundamental had shifted, not just in his own approach to kingship, but in the relationship between the monarchy and the people it served. For the first time in years, he felt like he was actually leading rather than simply performing leadership. The rest of the walkabout continued in this new vein. They met with community leaders who spoke frankly about the challenges facing their neighborhoods. They listened to young people express frustration about economic opportunities and political representation. They talked with elderly residents about feeling forgotten and invisible in a rapidly changing society. Each conversation built on the last, creating a cumulative understanding of the complex reality facing modern Britain. But more than that, it demonstrated that authentic leadership could emerge from acknowledging limitations and engaging honestly with difficult questions. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Jenkins approached them one final time. "Your Majesties," she said, "I want to thank you for today, not just for visiting our community center, but for showing us that it's possible to be both powerful and humble, both leaders and fellow human beings struggling with the same challenges we all face." Charles took her hand in both of his. "Mrs. Jenkins, thank you for helping us remember that the best service comes from genuine connection, not from maintaining distance." As they walked back to their car, Charles and Camilla could hear the conversations continuing behind them. People weren't just talking about having met the royals. They were talking about the ideas and emotions that have been shared. They were continuing the discussions about leadership, service, vulnerability, and the possibility of institutions that could evolve to better serve human needs. "How do you feel?" Charles asked his wife as they settled into the car for the journey back to the palace. "Exhausted," Camilla replied honestly, "and exhilarated, and terrified about what we've just set in motion." "Do you regret it?" She considered this seriously. "No. For the first time in years, I feel like we did something that actually mattered. Something that connected us to the people we're supposed to serve instead of separating us from them." Charles nodded, watching the London landscape pass by through the window. The afternoon had transformed his understanding of what monarchy could be in the modern world. Not a distant symbol of tradition, but an active force for encouraging authentic dialogue about the challenges facing society. But he also knew that this was just the beginning. The real test would come in sustaining this new approach, in building on the connections they had made today, and in proving that what they had started was more than just a single afternoon's experiment in accessibility. The revolution in royal engagement that had begun with Camilla's morning breakdown was now fully underway, and there was no turning back.